Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Libby Book Club for WA. I'm your host, David Allen Patali, and tonight my guest is Ben Hobson, who's the author of The Death of John Lacey, which has just been published by Allen and Unwin Australia. Now, this is a gripping, stunning piece of fiction that we're going to dive into very deeply tonight. But before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting to you tonight from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And Ben, I think that's a really important thing to say, not just because it's the right thing to do, but this is there's a colonial aspect to your novel that is really deftly handled. Can you tell us a little bit about what attracted you to write a story set on Australia's colonial frontier with all of the fraught history that entails, and how was it an act of courage or bravery to dive into this, or were you just attracted to it as a dangerous topic?
I mean, you blimmin' start off with the blimmin' doozies, mate. Tell
Oh,
you
mate.
what, we're into it. What originally attracted me to the novel was, I think, the character of John Lacey. He was the very first thing that came to me, and he was this man who he didn't have a sense of any type of empathy for any other human being. And I wanted to write from his perspective to actually try to understand how a person could possibly be like that. And then I was trying to think of an area where a person like that could really thrive. And so I was immediately drawn to the 19th century Australia, and then the goldfields as well. Because the goldfields, obviously there was so much going on there. And in the early days, there was this lack of the presence of the law and things like that. So I sort of thought, a person like that in that situation, what would he do? And so when I'm writing, it's much more of an effort in, I try to inhabit the characters, and then I try to be led by what that character would naturally do. And so John Lacey's mindset is to not look at anybody as though they were a human being worth respecting. If he were to cause offense, he wouldn't be sorry that he'd caused offense and try to make amends. The only reason he'd try to do that was because he wanted to save face to then use that person later on. He's very cold, manipulative, and he looks at people like objects. And he was really based on a lot of people who I've encountered in real life, I think, tragically. I think there's a lot of people in positions of power in just everyday life. And, people, hi, everybody, by the way. Hello, everybody. People in the chat and everyone here, I'm sure you've experienced people who seem to be able to be cold-hearted and ruthless in their decisions, and always keeping an eye on profit margins or their political agenda or things like that. And these people are awfully compelling, and they're kind of, our systems reward these people as well. They get rewarded with kudos, or they improve their bottom line, and they get a lot of power, I think. And we give them the power because it's something about a person who is so determined and who can actually make those decisions. Like, they're weirdly charismatic too. I think that's why a lot of them are politicians as well. Quite psychopathic, maybe. But so I put John Lacey in the goldfields, and so I just sort of wanted to see what he would do. And I think tragically it was very quickly that I cottoned on to the idea that there were First Nations people, the Wadawurrung people in the area, who he would be easily able to manipulate, unfortunately, because the system was such that they weren't protected. They weren't afforded the protection of the culture or the law. And, they were pushed out of their land. And looking at the state of the goldfields as well, there was so much destruction. And it is ignorance on my part, but that's part of the journey of writing this book. I started to read about the Wadawurrung depended on that land. Like, they had crops that they would have there. They would have things that they'd come back to there. They would hunt there. and then the settlers and the prospectors just wiped it out, just dug holes. I mean, there's no workplace health and safety in 19th century Ballarat. So it was just complete decimation. And so a person like John Lacey would look at all these people and he would think, like, who can I use? Who can I abuse? And I sometimes think, I don't know whether I consider John Lacey, and again, this is me speaking, so I don't know whether I'm an authority on this at all. In fact, I know I'm not. I don't know whether I think he's racist. I think he just takes the opportunities present to him. I think he looks at people, I think he looks at everyone as equally worthless, unfortunately. And it just so happened that the system was set up in such a way that he was able to abuse, especially the Wadawurrung people, which was very tragic, and a lot of that was rooted in type of history. So I don't know whether it's brave of me at all, but it was a lot of work. It was a lot of thought. It was a lot of effort to be sensitive in portrayal. It was a lot of work with the Wadawurrung people. You know, it was a lot of collaboration, and yeah, I don't know whether I'd consider it to be brave. I think it was confronting for me though, and I want to be an author who dives into things that are confronting. So hopefully I've done that.
I think you have, and like you say, it's the glamour of evil. It's the devil gets the best lines. So, but it's not just about John Lacey. There's so much more to this novel. There's so many different aspects to it. There's other characters. Can you tell us in your own words, and for the benefit of those listening in, there are people that I know have read the book. There are people who have started it. There are people who may be tempted. Can you give us your version of events? What is the death of John Lacey about? Big question.
Can I ask you, do you like being asked this question when you're talking about your book?
Not particularly, because the temptation is the elevator pitch. But then it's also, you've got to go off and maybe to the year 12 English interpretation.
Yeah. No, you're right. It's like I should be able to answer it by now, because you have to be able to pitch the novel, but it is a difficult book to talk about. It's I'd say it's an Australian Western is sort of how I've always thought of it. And it did really start, and it centers on the death of John Lacey. I mean, it's a bit of a spoiler. It's in the title. It's on the first page. He dies. But the book is really about unraveling the cause of his death. And in the creation of John Lacey, when I originally wrote the first part of this book, I wrote that section, The Conquest of John Lacey, and then I stopped. And that was all the book was going to be. It was going to be a 25,000 word novella, and it was just going to be that, which was a very dark and dismal place to be in, because he is a pretty horrible picture of what humanity can become, I think, and has been. And so it was an effort that I wanted then to, if I've set up this character who is this powerful, malevolent, uncaring, unflinching, determined, perfectly comfortable with violence at every capacity, he's a real villain. And so the effort of the novel was to set up a scenario where there were people standing up to him. And to me, the novel is really about characters who sort of, despite the circumstances, actually managed to stand up to John Lacey. I mean, and again, people listening in, and David, like, you think about, I think about my own sense of morality, and I think I try to be a very good person as often as I possibly can. I don't steal food from other people who I work with from the fridge. You know how they have labels on their food, it says Bill's spaghetti bowl. I don't just go in and take Bill's spaghetti bowl and eat it in front of him. But how far would you actually stand on your moral principle? Like, how far would you need to be pushed before you start to bend? And so you think about, if I were hungry, what if I was starving? And what I think ends up happening to some of the characters in the novel, what happens when they, when especially Gilbert's family is threatened, and Ernst, what would you do if your family were threatened? Would you go and take Bill's spaghetti bowl? And then what if Bill were guarding his spaghetti bowl? Would you push him out of the way? you know what I'm saying? Like it's a bit of therefore, but the grace of God go I think, in a lot of these different people. But
That
I,
constant question that was being asked,
yeah,
it's is it black and white? Is it right and wrong? The answer is it's complicated, but then it always circles back to no, there is a binary choice here.
yeah, yes, yeah. And I think that from our positions now, it's very easy to judge people, I think. And I always try to never be judgmental in the characters I create, even of John Lacey. Just try to present him as he is. But I often wonder about how far my moral code would stretch before I bend it a little bit to save and help the people I love. So that's really what the book's about. It's about people coming into combat, really, and pushing up against John Lacey, who is seated in this throne of power, and what sort of a person could possibly stand up to a man like that.
Thank you. And if anyone has a question for Ben, please feel free to pop something in the chat. Pop a question in the chat whenever you like, and I'll weave it into our discussion. I'll also leave some time at the end where we can have some questions put to Ben as well. So remember, this is a book club. It's a chat. I'm here with a nice single malt whiskey. I think Ben's got himself a drink too. If you've got a cup of tea.
I have a very cheap whiskey, and it is a Ned Kelly sour mash, which I feel was on brand a little bit. So that's where I'm at. It's actually, what time is it here? It's 9:15 in my neck of the woods.
7-Eleven here in WA, so we're still
Beautiful.
a little behind, but that's okay. Now, I'd just like to read from the back, the blurb from the back, because I think it beautifully encapsulates what is a complex story. So
They do a much better job than I just did, I can tell you that.
John Lacey's lust for power and gold brings him riches and influence beyond his wildest dreams. Only he knows the terrible crime he committed to attain that wealth. Years later, as Lacey ruthlessly presides over the town he has built and named after himself, no one has the courage to question his power or how he wields it. Brothers Ernst and Joe Montague are on the run from the law. They land in Lacey's town and commit desperate crimes to avoid capture. Lacey vows retribution and galvanizes those in town to hunt them down. But not everyone is blind to Lacey's evil, and a reckoning is approaching. I love that it's a reckoning.
Yeah.
You said there was a Western aspect to this. It's Clint Eastwood Western in my reading of that, but Unforgiven. Power,
Yes.
that sort of thing. Not spaghetti
Well,
Western.
I'm applauding your taste, my man. That's 100%. Unforgiven, where we actually get to see the hero myth turned on its head a little bit. And it's not as black and white as good guy shoots bad guy. Yeah, love that.
Well, just I've got a great question. Says from Justin Lee. Hello from Tennessee. I'm getting major Blood Meridian vibes here. The Cormac McCarthy book. Was that a big influence?
I'm going to do this every time someone mentions something. Thank you, Justin. Massive. Cormac McCarthy, I think, has been the novelist whose work has most changed my own way of thinking about what books can be. He's kind of punk rock. Like, he kind of pushes back against a lot of the way that people normally ingest books, I think. And he's so spare and he's so beautiful. I certainly don't think that I hold a candle in his presence, but he's a massive influence.
Yeah, you do.
Say that again, sorry, I missed it.
You do have punctuation in yours.
Yeah, a little. I have a little bit more. I did take out the talking marks though, so I mean that's a Cormac thing. But yeah, Blood Meridian, man, what a book! One of my top books. I actually think my favorite book of his. I think my favorite is The Crossing. I really love how stripped back The Crossing is. But Blood Meridian, man, I love that book so much. And yeah, a character like Judge Holden. I wouldn't say is necessarily influential on John Lacey. They're pretty different, but just the way he wields his power, is a similarity probably. What a good question, man. You got a good audience here.
We do. And Helen Matthew is asking, which character did you relate to? Did you most relate?
Helen. Hello, Helen. Thank you. Yeah, good question. There's actually a character in sort of the last third of the book named Gilbert Delaney. He is probably the closest character I've ever written to myself. Um, I have my own sense of faith, and Gilbert Delaney is a reverend. Gilbert Delaney is a family man. He loves his family, and he's often debating with himself about what the right course of action is, which is very similar to me. Um, he often stands up to John Lacey as well, which is something I hope I would do, in my best version of myself. But he also has a type of, I guess I'd categorize it as an obsessive compulsive disorder, but it's sort of in the framework of 19th century church in Australia. So he often thinks he's being tormented by demonic attack. And this is all based on, I've gone through my own bouts of, I've sort of gone through my own obsessive thoughts, sort of a spiraling of thought that you're unable to control, but mine never manifested into the way it often does, where people have to wash hands and things like that. But I do have a friend. He's actually my best friend. And when he was in high school, he went through a particular type of obsessive compulsive disorder that was phrased in the religious. And so every morning before he went to school, he would have to pray 50 times as he put on one sock. And then the prayer would have to be uttered in the exact right intonation and the exact right phrasing. And if he didn't get it right, he couldn't go on. Much the same way I think people would wash their hands, and it has to be a particular way. And it was actually quite debilitating for him. He actually ended up missing a lot of school because he couldn't get out the door. And he overcame a lot of that. He had a lot of professional help, and he's come out of that a lot. Which I'm very grateful for. But I think Gilbert Delaney, with his struggles with obsession and I guess maybe his own sense of shame, I think he carries around with him, and his obsession with trying to be a good person. I think Gilbert's probably the closest I've ever come to writing someone like me. Good question.
Very good question. And Ben, keeping with your sense of morality and your faith and everything that's from you, that's in this book, do you believe in evil, or is it more that notion that's brought up by Steinbeck in East of Eden of Tim Shell, that thou mayest, that man may choose?
That's very interesting. I definitely do believe in evil. I think that man is very capable of being evil. But I do think that we're responsible. I do think that human beings have choices to commit evil things or good things. I think there are things that we can call objectively evil. I do think that there are measures. This is just personal. I don't know whether any of my characters necessarily reflect that. But yeah, it's interesting. Like I'm a big believer in the idea that everyone is worthwhile. I believe everyone is born with an innate sense of worth. Like, we're all human beings. Every single person on the planet is born with worth. So it was really interesting to write John Lacey, who thinks the opposite of that. And even in his, the book opens with his final ever thoughts, and there's no remorse. I would think, how they often say, what's the saying? There's no atheists in foxholes. It's about, like, when we're really pushed to the wall, like, we really see what we're made of. But John Lacey gets pushed there, and you see that he's true to his nature.
Rotten to his core.
Yeah, he is.
Well, I guess suppose from that, there are characters in your book that they do choose the right way. And I want to talk about the frontier aspect. Going out to the goldfields, away from the cities. Cities are always said to be places of sin and temptation, but I don't know, further out in the goldfields and on Lightning Ridge and those sort of places, the further you get from the long arm of the law or authority, people were completely islands unto themselves, weren't they?
Yeah. Yeah.
How did you go? How did you approach writing that? I mean, a combination of research, but also mentally and spiritually preparing yourself to inhabit that space.
Yeah, well, I think that's something that Cormac does extremely well, but it's probably one of the things that draws me most to novels is where it's kind of a little bit it's kind of a little bit characters who have to depend on their own sense of or ability to fend for themselves. And it's at those moments, I think, like I was talking about with you, it's easy from a place of luxury to sort of discuss like the fact that we can discuss morality or philosophy or theology, like the fact that we can discuss that, we're actually in a pretty privileged position. Like it's luxurious. But I think a lot of people in those positions where they were literally farming every day to put food on the table for their families, do you really I don't know how much time they would have spent really agonizing over their morality. You know what I mean? It was just get the food on the table.
Exactly. Yeah. Ernst's father, he's a very tired man in the opening third. He's a tired man who's tempted to I don't want to have any too many spoilers here, but yeah, a tired man who's tempted to go off and cheat on his wife and have
He,
another start.
yeah, see, Edwin to me is the way he views people, I think is actually almost more insidious than late John Lacey. Because John Lacey, again, he doesn't question things. Like he's not even approached with a question. So most of us, when we face a situation like what's the right or wrong thing to do, we're faced with that question, right? He doesn't think it.
He doesn't
So
have the question. He never.
no question. He just goes and does what he wants. But Edwin,
Yeah.
he has the question, and yet he continues to choose the wrong thing and sort of justifies it to himself. Like I think he's quite insidious in a lot of ways and very selfish.
And
Um, but I don't say that in the book. I try to let people come to him on their own.
on that, I really enjoyed the depiction of communities between the indigenous and the settlers. The way that we're all human, but there was a difference in how they related to each other.
Yeah.
How did that? You mentioned you did a lot of consultation.
Mm.
How did that come through in the book for you?
Yeah, it was a lot of consultation. Very early on into the process, I made contact with the Wadawurrung people, who are the First Nations people who are represented in the book, and they put me into contact with an artist, and her name's Marlene Gilson, who it turns out, I mean, I sound very ignorant here, but it turns out she's actually a phenomenal artist. Her work's in Germany. It's been on the Sydney Opera House, like in a giant projection. Like I was kind of in the presence of royalty a little bit, which I didn't realize till later. I Googled her name. But she was very excited to tell this part of history. And when I was in collaboration with her, it was really all about, I wrote all the characters, but when she read a very early draft, and so my questions to her were, is anything here inauthentic? Is there anything you want me to change? Is there anything you'd want to add? And she did. There were little moments that she wanted to add in. There were names that she wanted me to place in there. There was a corroboree in the book now, but there wasn't one before. And she made notes. She's like, that was a big thing for us. I would have liked to have seen one. And she was very informative of the sense of the ending of the novel as well. It ended, again, not to spoil things, but although, I mean, maybe everyone's read it, I don't know, but the ending was a little bit more hopeless. And her note, she doesn't have a computer, and so her son Barry scanned all of her notes and emailed them to me. So I've got these handwritten notes in a file in my email.
Gold dust. Yeah,
I know, it's amazing. But there was a note for the ending, and so if there is a sense of hope at the end, it really is, I think, because of Marlene.
Just gonna put some questions to you from the audience because they're coming.
Oh, happy.
So, Julie, I just wanted to say, just back to our earlier points, I wanted to say thanks for doing a great job of portraying OCD in such a realistic and compassionate way. I think that really circles back to what we're saying about building community and building, choosing right allows compassion. It allows community to be built. Was that an undercurrent for you in this, or it?
When
You
you
know,
when you say that, do you mean as far as within the novel, communities building each other up, or do you mean as in a sense of the way we're talking now, and this is a little community?
a bit of both. That our
Mm.
frontier started off, well, frontier in any place started off as a rough place, but decisions were made that allowed us the privilege of sitting here and having this chat.
Yeah, that's very true.
So that's the
I think
decision.
the community in Ballarat, I think, is definitely something that was pretty important. But again, it's John Lacey there, so he's not. The only way he looks at community is in a way to further himself. I mean, he kind of sets up the storehouse in the section where he's the conquest of John Lacey. He's just doing that to present a front to people. Like he sort of uses community. Yeah, I don't know, but I'm a big fan of communities. I love these communities. I love book clubs. I actually, I've said it a couple of times, but if a person doesn't have church, I think books are one of the last places people have time to sit and chat about ideas. Like I legitimately think that. I don't think that there's any other avenue that you really sit down and have a deep discussion about morality where else but a book and a book club. So I'm a big fan of communities for sure.
I agree, and I think it was David Foster Wallace. He said, the library is one of the last bastions of places that you're not actually expected to spend any money. You can just go and be there.
Just be there. And yeah, isn't that amazing? And sorry, to circle back to, thank you very much for saying that the portrayal of obsessive compulsive disorder was compassionate. I felt a lot for Paul, my friend, in that time. He's thanked in the book as well, and he's read a draft of it as well. So it was actually hard though, because a 19th century reverend in Australia, he wouldn't have had the mental health framework to think about things. So yeah, it was a big battle and I also didn't want him to sort of be cured of it in the end, like, oh, now I'm fixed and now I'm all better. Because it's not about that. It's about accepting who he is, I think, rather than battling who he is. I think that's more important.
And Amber says the comparison between the Lacey brothers gave a good example of nature versus nurture, assuming they had fairly similar upbringings, yet such different people. Was that Gray's purpose as a character to make John's character sharper? I just have to explain Gray in context.
That's amazing. What a good question. Yeah, Gray. Gray is sort of the better half. He is the more charismatic. He's more of a people person. He is kind of sorry. He has an actual. Yeah, he has a conscience. Amazingly. Yeah, I don't know whether or not it was ever in. I do love that you've brought up nature versus nurture. I think that's really interesting, and there is a difference in them. But I did labor over not really giving John Lacey any excuse for the way he is. Not that, I mean, that might sound flippant, but I didn't want him to sort of say, I'm this way because this happened to me in my past. I think he is like, he's almost a force of nature. Like he's almost elemental to me. He's not, I don't know where he comes from. I don't know why he thinks that way. And it's interesting to me to think about how many people in our current world are the same way. And like, I'm a high school teacher as well. And there's just the myriad of stories you have of students, and you'll meet some who are, very difficult. I'll frame it in that language. And then you meet students who are very kind, and where they come from is always different. It's just, it's like all things in life. It's not as easy to trace. But yeah, Gray's kind of the one person who Lacey actually has some affection for. I think he does, but he is an interesting counterpoint. And yeah, it's interesting for me to ask you guys, like, do you think that Lacey actually loves his brother Gray, or is Gray just useful to him? I don't know. I don't know what I think.
Well, I'll leave it to the comments because I don't want to swing either way. But Helen also says, thanks, Ben, for giving us an opportunity to think about it in a historic context. I think that the right and wrong and those sorts of decisions, less of an industrial disease. It's interesting, I think, because I mean,
Mm,
the line from Last of the Mohicans kept springing to mind, where they accuse the white settlers of being afflicted with the sickness of greed.
mm,
I've always loved that line because and it resonated with me very deeply because right off the bat, Death of John Lacey is about ownership of anything, land, people, the sky above, kind of thing.
yeah,
In sharp contrast to the First Nations people who lived with the land and with each other. What is
yeah.
it about these characters that makes them want to own, to dominate,
Mm.
have? There's pure reasons for building community and expanding, but there's also dominance, power, and control.
Yeah, it's so interesting, eh? Yeah, because it's so interesting because there's so many people who I think have extremely good intentions, like Gilbert, but they still are deciding the fate of other human beings. And even though they're doing their best to choose wisely and they have the best intentions, like it's still, when you're talking about the life of another person, it's still controlling. Um, so even though you might be choosing for the right reason, the fact that you're choosing at all is quite a controlling and dominating thing. And I think about often the way politicians and the way, even we debate ideas of politics and the ideas of each other, and we forget that there are people who we're talking about, what to do about the homeless crisis, or, things like that. Those are real human beings. And I fear a lot of the time that in the way we frame things, that they're often very quickly overlooked. Um, I do think it's human nature to, I don't know whether it's human nature. I think that there is something in all of us that is deeply afraid. And so in that fear, we attempt to control everything that surrounds us, including people, including circumstances. I don't know whether you could say that about John Lacey, but I think a lot of greed comes from that. It's a sense of, if I can control all these things, if I have enough money and I can put all these things into place, and status, and there's a lot of things in to do with class in there as well. But it is about, like, if I'm up here, none of these people can affect me. And I think it's out of fear. I think it's out of cowardice that a lot of us try to do that, including myself. I'm not at all saying that I'm not privy to the same things. I absolutely am.
That's what I really enjoyed about the book, Ben. It's honest, in a in the truest sense of that.
Thank you.
Not in a Pollyanna-ish way either. Just it's honest, but it doesn't uh, dwell sadly in the honesty, if you know, if I can say that. This is how it is, and
Mm,
a mirror. It's a very sharp mirror.
thank
Uh,
you. I think I
that,
often, as a human, dwell a long time, sadly, in the honesty. So it's good I haven't written that.
no, that's true. Was it so for that reason? I can imagine if you took the through line of the plot and everything, you could write this in a very simple, direct, and different way. Did you? Was it harder to write in the way that you wanted it, to really honor this story, to really tease out the themes you wanted, and to depict things in the way that you did?
Such
Was there an easy path, and that you took the much harder one?
Man, it's such a good question. I will 100% be honest with you. I don't know any other way.
Good.
Um, I and I've tried. I've tried to write books. I've tried to write books that aren't confronting. I try to write books that are crowd pleasing, with winning protagonists that people can like, with only slight flaws that we can get past. Like, I don't know. I can't do it. I just sort of have to write the book that comes to me. And it was a really interesting book to write and to structure, but it really did come out the way it came. And it's really interesting, the structure of it too, because it's the first time, where with an editor, normally they give story notes, and you get these big notes about this character's not quite here, this bit here doesn't quite land, you might want to move this, and it's all about the structure of the story. First time in my life where they wrote back and they're like, you don't need to change any of the structure, because it feels like if you take out one little brick, the rest of it sort of falls down. And I don't know how I did that, but there it is.
Well, I was going to say you're 3 books in now, To Become a Whale,
Mhm.
and also Snake Island, different, but also within the Ben Hobson feel, I would say,
Thank you.
all very different, but there's a through line here. This is your oeuvre, this is, was this a departure for you in any sense?
No, I thank you for saying that. I actually often do wonder whether or not I'm just so eclectic and I do a lot of different things. I don't know. I think I'm slowly sort of figuring out what my thing is. I don't know whether I'll ever be finished figuring it out. Um, it didn't, no, it didn't feel like a departure. I kind of just go where I'm interested. I
Yeah.
just go with stories that interest me, and I don't think I necessarily really question it. I just sort of do this. In theory, if something interests me, in theory, it's going to interest other people as well. And I kind of let the books. Um, I often think about them becoming the truest sense of themselves,
Mm.
and my job is to remove my own preconceived ideas and the way my story brain tries to manipulate things and try to all those story tricks that we all have. My job is to try to put away all that stuff and just be honest, which is very difficult to get the voices of critics, and um, I'm my own worst critic, but to get that, I try to not be petty, like just write it honestly. I try. Hemingway said that, right? Don't use a $5 word when a 20-cent one will do. Whatever he said, like I'm a big believer in that.
That's right. That's great. And I've got a question here from Sharon. She says, I really enjoyed the book. Was it difficult portraying how the First Nations people were treated without being too harsh or too lenient?
Mm,
It's a really interesting pivot point there.
yeah, yeah. It's a very difficult line. Yeah, and I was also, Sharon. I was also really aware of our real history, and then I'll be real. It can feel like using people's trauma in fiction, and that feels gross. So it was always about trying to be authentic and be representative in a way that's not not Fast and the Furious where you're driving a car and look how cool, how violent it is, and Vin Diesel's chopping off some guy's head. Like, it's not. I'm not that writing that. I'm writing very cold, calculated, very just kind of. Honestly, it's almost like I just write it flat and just try to represent it as it truly was, which I think can actually make it worse and more shocking to people. Um,
What do they say? The best jokes are told straight. The best drama is told straight. So
oh man, 100. I haven't heard that, but I 100% agree with that. Um, yeah, it's a very tricky thing. I would say that though that my book, in comparison to reality, is pretty light, even though I think my book's quite confronting. Um, yeah, I think the reality was worse.
and I mean, just like you say, just to be real, in the context of the debate we're having now, The Voice. This is the environment that this book has come out in. You first conceived of the book, I'm guessing, a long time ago. You mentioned it. You started writing. I think it was contracted 2 years ago, 4 years ago.
Yeah, I started writing it in 2019. Yeah.
As a as a citizen of the country and seeing these debates and everything going around, and now dropping a piece of culture into the culture
Hmm.
alive, at a pivot point in Australian history potentially.
Yeah, I mean it hasn't escaped me. It's fairly interesting, I think. Um, I would say that my book, I don't I always try to avoid being like preachy or didactic, or there's no message beyond the one that people, I think, would like to draw from it. Like, it's just me trying to present a complicated part of history. Um, but I would say that if you want to talk about perspectives on, the voice and any other aspects of modern sort of political, things that are going on in our nation, I would say to talk to people it affects first before talking to someone like me. But I think that's kind of what, if there is any message, that's kind of part of what the book is, which is kind of maybe a better way of approaching things would be with humility and to ask rather than tell. Yeah, if that makes sense.
And artistically, was it, just to go back to the consultation, was it difficult to almost surrender part of your artistic process? I mean, we are sort of inculcated with that view that, the artist is the be all and end all genius, and that kind of
Yeah, maybe I
extraordinary.
just have a low opinion of myself, but I don't think that. No, look, I came up through music, and so I was a musician. I played in a band. If you want to go to Spotify and listen to some Sounds Like Chicken, you want some heavy punk ska hardcore, played bass. We've got 1,000 monthly listeners now, everybody, for an album that came out in 2007. That's pretty good. Anyway, sorry. But often with the band, right, I'd write a riff. I was a bass player. I'd say, hey, I've got this riff, and I'd be boom, 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 and I'd play it. And I lived with the guitar player and the drummer. And so they would both say, all right. And I could tell by the way they said all right that they weren't that keen on my riff.
All right. Yeah,
But what they do, let's go and put it up on its feet. And so we all went into the rehearsal room and we'd jam on it for half an hour. And then without them saying a word, I noticed after that half hour. And I was like, yeah, you know what? It's not working, which is really smart of them because it made me feel heard. I don't think they'll calculate it at all, but that creative thing where you get it out up on its feet, you have a look at it, you test it, you fudge it and you press it and you squeeze it and see if it bends at the edges. But Marlene, no, I was 100% okay. If she had told me to just stop writing, that this book was not a good project, I would have stopped writing. I'm much more interested in writing something. Like I'm not the smartest person in the room. Like she's the smartest person in the room. So I'm 100% fine with that. I love being edited. I love comments from people I trust. Yeah, I'd say that I'm fairly collaborative. Yeah. So yeah, it wasn't too bad for me. I'm not precious at all.
I was going to say as well, you're also a teacher, a husband, and a father. So no, you cannot. You've got to be willing to take feedback, I'm guessing.
Yeah. Hunter, yes, yep. I get fed back on every day.
And on that as well, I mean, your kids are pretty young, right? But when they're ready to read The Death of John Lacey, I know you said there wasn't any particular message, but is there some wisdom in there?
I hope so. I hope it comes from a place of what I said before about there, but for the grace of God go I. I often think that as humanity, we're often right now, I think we're the most judgmental we've ever been. I think we're also weirdly also on the opposite end of that as well. We're also the most tolerant, and it's a really strange space that we're in.
Right.
I think social media and the internet especially has just afforded a lot of people to be very quick to judge and to look at something and just think and just be judgmental and think, well, this person's terrible, this person's made a bad decision. But I just think that it's easy to do that. It's much harder to try to look at ourselves and think, I'm capable of some pretty terrible things. I'm capable of making mistakes. I'm sure I've said things in my past that have been awful that I probably would regret, that I probably don't remember. But I just think that I always try to look at people, everyone, and when I'm a teacher as well, look at students who are swearing at me and throwing things at me. I always try to first go from a place of compassion and think, that's me, and to look at the worth of every human. Um, it's really it's easy to like people who are kind-hearted and friends to us, but it's very hard to love people who aren't lovable. But they're the ones who kind of need it the most, I think. So, I hope that's in the book. I don't know.
Yeah.
I hope
Okay.
it's in.
I was going to ask as well, just a corollary to that. Was John Lacey's skin difficult to inhabit, or was it ever so slightly enjoyable? Like
It was
in a
oddly,
bad.
it was oddly easy and enjoyable in that all of my characters do have that moral agony in them about what's right and what's wrong. He doesn't have it. He's just clear, and he does what he likes. Is actually easy, and that's what I think also concerned me. Like it's a burden to have a conscience.
Yes.
It's a burden, and we often agonize and think and try to do the right thing. Like, wouldn't it be easier if we didn't give a crap? And not only did we, if we ignored it, but like if we never thought of it, we could just ignore each other, and then the world would be horrible. But man, my life would be easier.
It's tempting, isn't it? That
Yeah,
tempting.
unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah. I've got another question here from Juliana, admin. Going back to your discussion of evil, I felt that your characters became evil as they lost family, and that family helped the good people stay good.
Hmm.
Dell becoming a lackey of Lacey, or Ernest being slightly redeemed once he knows Joe needs him. Did you mean to include that theme where people can be redeemed by family or community or connection?
Man, good question. I don't know. That wasn't intentional, but it's something I do think.
Awesome.
I think that we are redeemed by the people who love us. I think that we are consistently rescued by people who rely on us. I can't be an asshole because I have kids and I love my kids and I want them to grow up to be good people too. I don't want to be selfish. Um, I don't know. I think that's a really interesting question. That certainly wasn't intentional, but that's really interesting that it's in there.
And can you tell us a bit about the writing process? I always love this part.
How long have you
Let's talk about the road to Calvary. The absolute
got?
ordeal of writing the death of John Lacey. I mean,
Yeah.
coming off Snake Island, was it a thing back then, or was it circling around, or?
Yeah, no, so I came off Snake Island and I toyed around with a few different ideas. And so I wrote The Conquest of John Lacey, the first section or the second section now in this novel. So I wrote that, and it was about 25,000 words, and I wrote it in this way that was really pure. At least it felt pure to me. It was just purely what I wanted to write. And it felt visceral and real and raw and spare and all those things that I admire in other writers. But I also felt like I wasn't really equipped to keep writing. I hadn't done enough consultation. I hadn't, I just sort of put it on the shelf, and I thought I'll leave that one. And then I went off and I wrote a whole other book.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I wrote a 90,000 word book. It was an action thriller. It had an Australian federal police agent. It had a terrorist attack and viruses, and this guy was running around Melbourne trying to. There was like 8 assassins all trying to get this weapon, and they all had backstories. It was really, vibrant. It was sort of action thriller. It was kind of a marketable book. He was a winning protagonist. I went to my agent. I went to beta readers. I did the whole thing. I put my whole self into it. And then I got a agonizing phone call from my publisher saying that she didn't respond to it, and that in addition to her not responding to it, none of the other people in the publishing house who I'm with responded to it either. And there's a lot of ways to take that. My way was to feel awful and I'm stuffed and I'm a loser and I can't do anything, and all the self-doubt that creative people experience. And I also thought, though, that she would want, if there was any hope that this book was good, she would want to publish it because she wants to sell books. And the fact that she couldn't see that in there sort of said to me, I'm a bit in trouble with this one. But then in that place of despair, I opened up my computer files and had a look at some old projects, and I opened up John Lacey, and
Yeah.
it was like this. It was like this. It was like a wound that had been expunged out of me somehow. Like I felt healed when I read it, and I was like, "Oh, that's what I do. This is the thing I do." And I don't know what I was doing with that other thing. I love films like that. I love books like that, and I don't know whether my motivations were great. Like, am I writing to write a good book, or am I writing to sell books? I don't know. I don't know where I was at, but I felt relieved that she'd rejected it. And then I thought, well, clearly my taste is broken and I'm going to give up. But in my giving up, I'm going to write the best book I've ever written. And I'm going to leave with my head high. And if no one wants this, no one wants it. But I'm going to write the exact book that I've always wanted to produce. And that's what I did. The actual process of writing it, I mean, we can talk about anything if you want, man. Like I used Scrivener.
Yep.
And it was scenes on the left-hand side, and it was really, okay, John Lacey exists. And then I sort of had this final confrontation where someone was protecting someone else, and John Lacey was trying to get this person down here. So, like, who's the person who stands in the gap? I need to tell everything about that person. Who's the person who he's protecting? I needed everything about that person. And the whole story really came out of that. Yeah, and I'd write 1,000 words a day every morning, and consultation and collaboration and edits and all those sorts of things. But, the modus operandi with the book is to never put any internal thoughts in any of the characters. I don't give them any sort of, you don't get to see inside their heads much at all. You get to see what they do and how that reflects what's in their heads.
I responded really strongly to that. That's to my taste completely.
Me too.
I like being shown.
Me too. Yeah, there was an effort in only showing, very spare, and deleting anything that was extraneous. There was a scene, as an example, early on where I had the character of Edwin, say to Ernst, his son, he says, "I love Yamonsi, my Wadarung mistress, but I don't love my wife." And he spelled it out just in language like that. And I had an editor early on who's my friend named Tim, but he circled it and he went lazy. He was my red pen editor, and I needed him.
Okay.
And it was lazy. I was just telling people how people felt. So I went back, like, is there a better way to show that? And then I came up with the scene in the book where Edwin farts in front of Yamonsi, and she giggles and punches him, so they're quite intimate. And then he farts in front of his wife, and she doesn't respond.
Yeah.
And I cannot tell you how pleased I was when I came up with using a fart to portray intimacy in the relationship.
Well, it's an important level of intimacy.
Did it work though? Like, you felt it, right? Like, it was.
You absolutely did.
So that was the book. The whole vibe of the book was always fighting to be smarter about how I showed things rather than lazy. And it took a very long time.
What did you say? To stand it up on its legs? Yeah.
What? What did you mean?
Stand it up on its legs. Is that what you said from being a musician?
Yeah, exactly. I had 2 early readers. One of them just said, "I love it. It's awesome. You've done a great job." And I need that too. But Tim, he's brutal. But he loves the same sort of books that I love. And I said to him, "Please," and I printed it out and I said, "Use a red pen and just destroy me." And he did. And it was very helpful. And I also named a character in the novel after him. And imagine what happens to my red pen editor in the book.
Well, he's in it. So that's good.
He's in there. Yeah, I told him I put him in there.
Well, Ben, we're coming up for time. Ron, we've got about 5 minutes left. So if you'd like to ask any question at all to Ben, please hit us with your questions. But I will circle back to a question from earlier, which it's from Andrea again. She says, "I'd love to see more of Ernst. Would you consider writing a spin-off exploring this character? I think there's so much to him.
Hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of missing years with this, isn't there? I've not considered it, no. I think if anything else were to be explored from this novel, I'll be real with all of you. Wouldn't it be a cool Netflix miniseries?
Yes.
Wouldn't
That's
it? Like like I feel like it would be cool, but I think if that were an opportunity, thank you. I can actually see Andrea. Yes, thank you. But I think if that were to happen, I think Ernst would be much more explored in that. I think.
totally. And on your cover quote here from Paul Daly, he says, where the Ballarat diggings meet Deadwood. I mean,
I
that's,
love
yeah,
Deadwood.
yeah.
Deadwood probably. Deadwood and Unforgiven
Bit of the
were probably
proposition.
two of the first real like westerns that I really latched into and felt deeply. Like, do you remember the scene in Deadwood? You know what though? The very opening scene of the pilot in Deadwood, where Bullock is standing. Remember what I was talking about? Bullock is standing in between this angry mob of farmers.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and he's here, and there's this guy who he's got in jail. He's going to hang, but he still confronts this mob of people, and he stands up to them.
Yeah.
That's a big inspiration for the ending of this book.
Yes. The badassness. Excellent. Well, we do have some support in the comments. Helen says yes. And also Peter saying, love the Zoom meeting, my first time. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us, Peter. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Peter. That's lovely.
And Ben, I suppose final question. What's next? Have you got something else dark and evil and mysterious menting in the bottom of your
I
files? What's going on?
and I have Okay, right now I have two things I'm working on. I'll give you the very brief pitch on both. One is a type of home invasion novel set in the same time area as this, where there's a family and there's bushrangers who are intent on robbing a stagecoach as it drives by, and they invade this home and sort of take them over, and there's also a cannibal. The other story is set in the realm of the modern, and it involves an old man waking up with a cockroach on his nose in the middle of the night. And he looks at the cockroach and he sees that in the cockroach, there's this whole life of creativity and meaning that perhaps his real regular life doesn't hold. And so he catches the cockroach and he breeds an army of them and he builds them a Lego city obsessively. And then he decides that he will create short films on YouTube using the cockroaches as his actors, and he never comments on the absurdity of it. And he treats it very seriously. And so he glues little capes to them and creates little superhero dioramas where cockroaches, he kind of squishes them a little bit. But that whole book is really about me talking about how art is kind of stupid and silly, but also really important to us. And it should be, but also it's not. And I think that's fun.
What do they say in Almost Famous? When it stops being stupid, it stops being important.
That's good. That's good. I hadn't heard that. This book, all books are 26, well, all books written in English, 26 different letters in different orders. How insane is it that they mean this much to us? And yet it's really important that they do mean this much to us. I kind of think that's interesting.
Ben, very quickly, because we've got less, just over a minute and a half left. Justin Lee says, I came across your work because of a blurb by Willie Vlorton. I think Justin's from our listener from Tennessee. Are you a fan of Willie Vlorton? And can you tell us who Willie is?
Yeah, Willie Vlorton, he's an incredible novelist, also incredible songwriter. And yeah, I say when I got that cover quote from Willie, no, I'd never read his books, but I since have read his books, and yes, am a fan of his, definitely. There was actually really also a very interesting film of his based on one of his books. I forget the name of it now. It was actually quite a beautiful little movie too. He's really deeply interested in young men, I think, as well. Yeah, really beautiful writer. That's really cool that you came across it through that, Justin. And thank you for tuning in from Tennessee. That's massive. That's a dream of mine to head to America. I've never been, but I really want to go.
Well, Ben, that's a great note to leave it on. Thank you very much for your time tonight. I really appreciate you sharing your journey in writing The Death of John Lacey, and also sharing insights from this truly magnificent book that you've created. Congratulations, and thank you for being a part of the Libby Book Club for WA. The Death of John Lacey is available on the Libby Book app, and you can access lots and lots of other titles on there for free, which is a wonderful service, isn't it? And
Awesome.
next month, our guest on the Libby Book Club for WA will be Fleur MacDonald for her new book, Into the Night. That's going to be a pretty cool chat to speak with a prolific Australian author who, you know, captures the voice of the bush so strongly. So that'll be March 15th, or the third Wednesday of the month for the Libby Book Club for WA. I'm David Allen Patali. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Ben. We'll see you later.
Thank you for having me, guys. It was a pleasure to be here.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.